There we go. All right. Well, hello, everyone. Let's see what's coming in. Rona's here. Well, if Rona's here, we can get started. All right. I'm going to mute everyone so we don't talk over each other. And let's begin because we actually have a lot to talk about today. We are going to attempt in 1 hour to talk about 3 major religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam, and how they differ from Judaism. Of course, we are not going to be able to go into depth in any of these different religions, and we're just going to give you sort of that surface level, but it'll show some of the major differences. And for me, it's what are the fundamental philosophical differences, right? We're not looking at all of the really close and fine distinctions, but really what are the major philosophical breaks? Kind of like what we did with Christianity. And we said, Judaism and Christianity agree on 80% of the stuff that's out there, but that 20% is pretty significant. And that's what we're going to do. Now, as we see with these other religions, at least with Buddhism and Hinduism, there's going to be a lot bigger differences. With Islam, now we're coming back to one of the Abrahamic religions, and so we'll start to see more similarities than we will differences as we go through. So welcome, everyone. Off we go. We are going to start today with Hinduism. And as we talk about Hinduism, it's important to know the history. Hinduism is actually the world's oldest religion, right? Judaism is pretty old, but Hinduism dates back all the way to 2000 BCE. And it developed originally and still has much and most, I would say, of its adherents living in India and in that part of the world. There were actually 2 different civilizations that came together to create Hinduism. There was the Indus Valley civilization, which was there in that area between 3500 and about 1500, and then and this group came to an end as a group of people called the Aryans came in, very different than what we talk about the Aryans in the modern world. But they were nomadic people that came in and invaded India. And ultimately, the combination, the alchemy sort of these 2 civilizations ultimately created the basis for Hinduism. It's actually quite a varied religion as practiced in different parts of the world because it developed over such a long period of time. And much like Judaism, that has, sort of the Sephardic tradition and the Ashkenazi tradition and the Mizrahi tradition, kind of depending on where you live and, where you come from, to some degree, Hinduism has that as well. The best way to sort of describe Hinduism or the start of Hinduism is with the story of a mysterious beast that appeared in the land of the blind. And the king, who was blind, sent all of his emissaries to sort of go and investigate what was happening and what this new mysterious beast was. And so they waited till it was asleep, and they cautiously went to go and feel to try and figure out what this beast was. And as the story goes, one person comes back to the king and says, it's like a wall. And another person came back and said, no, actually, it's like a spear. And then a third person said, well, no, you're both wrong. It's actually like a fan. It's like a tree. It's like a snake. It's like a rope, right? All these different people came and had such different expressions of what this beast was. And as the story goes, right, the blind men were describing the same animal, but they were only describing those parts that they could perceive, that they could feel, that they could touch. And therefore, their description was very limited. It didn't actually describe the whole. And if you were able to step back and really see the whole, everybody would say, oh, it's an elephant, right? But they couldn't do that because they were blind. So for Hinduism, that is how they sort of see the world. And even though there are different types of Hinduism, they all try to describe the same unchanging truth, unchanging reality of the universe. And this they call the Brahman. Now, when we think about Brahman, we said it's the absolute, unchanging, ultimate reality that Hindus believe exists beyond the world of appearances. And so when we look at our world, right, for Hindus, we're living in the world of the blind, because even though we see, we don't really see. We don't see the truth behind what's out there. We only see our little part of it. Some Hindus talk about Brahman as a deity, as God. Others see it as sort of a more impersonal power, which is beyond description and not deific, not in a godly sort of way. They talk a lot when trying to describe the Brahman of the legend of the salt and the water, right? They like to speak just like us in stories. Father asked the son to put salt in water and then take it back out again, right? You can't, it's there, it's in there, but it's invisible. You can't see the salt. You can taste it. So depending on how you're perceiving will determine whether or not you can perceive that salt in water. If you just look at a glass of salt water, you're not going to know it's salty. So that's the Brahman. We also talk about the Atman, right, in Hinduism. The Atman is the Hindu word for the soul. And Hindus teach that every individual has a soul that is called the Atman. Some see the soul as part of the Brahman, but others see it as actually the Brahman itself, right? It's connected in some way. The question is, how connected is it? An important concept within Hinduism is samsara. And that is the idea that living things do not have just one life. And they're actually caught in a cycle of birth and death and a rebirth. And this cycle is called samsara. So one of the things that differentiate philosophically, fundamentally between Judaism and Hinduism is this idea of multiple lives, right? In Judaism, with a very rare exception of a particular aspect of Kabbalah, which talks a little bit about reincarnation, we believe that there is one life. Each soul gets one life on this earth. For Hindus, this process of life and rebirth is seen as pointless and very, very difficult. And ultimately, it is the hope of every Hindu that they're going to be freed from it, because we are trapped in this cycle of birth and death and rebirth. We've all heard of the concept of karma. Karma is the power which keeps that wheel of life spinning. And it refers to the actions performed by each person during their lifetime. And a good action will move a person towards a better rebirth. Bad actions will move a person towards a poorer rebirth. And in Hinduism, it's possible that you can be reborn as an animal. And the challenge then is it's going to be very difficult to move up the ladder and to gain that knowledge that you're going to need to break the cycle. Ultimately, when you break the cycle, it's called moksha. That is the release from this cycle of birth and rebirth. And you can achieve moksha when you are able to see truly, right? When you're able to see the entire elephant and not just a part of it. In essence, when you replace your ignorance with true wisdom. But there's this force that is sort of preventing us from doing that, right? It's human nature, and in Hinduism it's called Maya, and it's the tendency to see things the wrong way, right? We automatically assume things, and it's not usually correct. It's often not correct. Once again, another story. A man runs into a room, thinks he sees a snake. In his panic, he runs out, rushes around trying to warn everybody. But when they go in there, they see the snake was actually just a piece of rope. That tendency of reacting and reacting incorrectly is something that we as humans have. And it holds us back, according to Hinduism, from seeing the truth and the reality of the world that's around us. And for many Hindus, the only truly real things are the Brahman and the Atman. The rest is illusion. It's just the way that we perceive the world, and it's not truth. Any questions on that? I know I just ran through that very quickly, but any questions on those concepts that we talked about? It's going to be important for when we talk about Buddhism. Okay. So let's discuss Buddhism. Historically, Buddhism was also developed in India by a man named Siddhartha Gautama. He ultimately became known as the Buddha, which means the enlightened one, because of his wisdom and what it is that he taught. It's important to understand that Buddhism comes from Hinduism, right? The two are very connected, and Buddhism is based on Hinduism, much in the same way that Christianity is based on Judaism, but then went off in its own direction. At the time of Gautama's birth, the focus, sort of the theological, philosophical focus that many Hindus were trying to figure out was, why do people suffer? And most importantly, how do we avoid that, right? Suffering was a huge problem for these people that ultimately created Buddhism. And the question is, why was it such a big problem? Well, if you believe in multiple lives, then suffering is going to happen again and again and again and again and again until you break that cycle. And so it's not just like, if you're living in a Jewish or a Christian paradigm, right? We suffer in this world and then we're free of it when we die. Now, in a Christian paradigm, maybe if we don't believe, we're going to suffer for all eternity, but that was our choice, right? And in a Jewish paradigm, maybe we suffer for a period of time, but again, that's our choice for the sins that we did. For Hindus, this isn't a choice. This is just reality, this brutal reality of suffering and multiple lives. Siddhartha was probably born in 563 BCE. It's a little difficult to date. There's some dispute in terms of the actual timing. And his father was the ruler of a small kingdom. His family were Hindus. As I said this already there. Now, the legend of his life tells that a fortune teller was asked when he was born, what was his life going to be? And the fortune teller told his father that he would be a great prince if he was prevented from seeing 4 different sights: a sick man, an old man, a dead man, and a monk. And if he didn't see them, he would be a great prince. If he did see them, then the fortune teller said he would take up his life as a wandering holy man. Well, his father didn't want him to be a wandering holy man, wanted him to continue to rule his kingdom. So he kept him in the palace and sort of locked him away, a little bit of a not a Cinderella story, but what's the person who gets put up, a Rapunzel story, right? The person who gets put up in the tower. Lock you away from everything. And he realized as he grew up that, he was rich and he was powerful, but even the most rich and the most powerful can't evade death and suffering and illness. And so he left and he went out for a drive in his chariot outside the royal park when he wasn't supposed to. And he saw the foresights that then led him again into this life of a wandering holy man. So he dedicated himself to trying to find an answer to the problem of suffering. And the story tells that he goes from one side of the spectrum to the other, from one extreme to the other. So he would spend time studying with holy men and time fasting for 6 years and really trying to figure out how to deal with the problem of suffering. But ultimately, he realized that extremes are not the way to actually solve the problem of suffering. They actually feed into the problem of suffering. And he vowed to adopt what he then called the middle way, which is fundamental to Buddhism. One day, he sat in the shade of a fig tree, and he remained there for many days in meditation. As dawn broke on one particular day, he was enlightened. He saw the meaning of everything. He, again, broke through that illusion and saw the truth. And from that day on, he was called the Buddha, which means the enlightened one. So what are some of the fundamental concepts of Buddhism? We start with the concept of nirvana. At the moment of enlightenment, Buddha attained nirvana. This is sort of the equivalent of moksha. It's the freedom from the cycle of birth and rebirth, and therefore then freedom from pain and suffering. Buddhists say that nirvana cannot be described in words. It lies beyond the definable. This state of true enlightenment and true connection with the universe. Buddha died at 80 and gained then another title, Tathagata, which is the thus gone. And this describes the state after death when one cannot be reborn. And for a Buddhist, that neither exists nor does not exist. You're sort of in this state. You're no longer dealing with suffering and all of that. But you don't completely disappear either. Buddhism is based on the 3 universal truths, the 4 noble truths, and the noble 8-fold path that they say will lead you to nirvana. So let's look at those. The 3 universal truths. Number 1, everything in life is impermanent and constantly changing. It's actually very similar to the Greek idea of the story of Herodotus, right? Who says it's impossible to step into the same river twice because it's constantly moving. And by the time you step into that same place, the river's completely different. Water's different. Everything's different. So everything is impermanent and changing. Truth number 2, because nothing is permanent, life is unsatisfactory. People desire and become attached to things that do not last. Now, this idea of life being unsatisfactory, I want us to remember that, because that is not a Jewish concept. It's going to be something that we really see the world very differently. And unlike Hinduism, Buddhism really believes that there is most Buddhists, there are different denominations within Buddhism as well, but most Buddhist denominations do not believe that there's an eternal soul. What people call the self is simply a collection of characteristics, of changing characteristics, because nothing is eternal. And these are the three sort of what they call three universal truths, which then lead us to the four noble truths. Number one, all life involves suffering. The cause of suffering is desire and attachment, right? We desire things, we get attached to things, but everything is constantly changing. Therefore, we're going to lose. We're going to feel bad about that. We're going to feel sad about that. We're going to feel angry about that. That's where suffering comes from. Desire and attachment can be overcome. And that's why you see, right, Buddhist monks, the highest level is they've actually gotten rid of everything that they own, because they're trying to shed themselves of desire and attachment. And the way to overcome them is the Eightfold Path, which we're going to look at in a second. You can see this one builds on the next. But let's just talk for a moment about the difference between Judaism and Christianity. And when we spoke earlier on about, Jubus, right? People who kind of straddle between Buddhism and Judaism and try to do both. I said to you that while some of the accoutrement, right, some of the practices, whether it be meditation or yoga, are totally fine with Judaism, these fundamental ideas are actually not compatible with Jewish beliefs, right? The issue of suffering, Judaism certainly understands that there's suffering in this world, but the idea of the entire world being illusion, and therefore we should detach ourselves, is actually diametrically opposed to Judaism, who says, hey guys, this is the only world you get. This is the only life you get. Tikkun olam, fix it, make it the best you possibly can. Not detach, but engage. Right? From a Jewish perspective, we engage, we don't detach. And those really pull us in two very different directions on how we're supposed to interact with the world around us. The ideal spiritual level, right, of a Buddhist is to be a hermit monk. The ideal spiritual level of a Jew is to be celebrating Shabbat with community. Right? It's a very different idea. So the Eightfold Path is the sort of moderate middle way that Buddha followed in his own search for enlightenment. It's really a code for living. And I'm not going to go into all of them. I'm just going to sort of tell you what they are, and you can get a sense of it. And if you're interested, you can look more for yourself. But it's about right understanding, right intent, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. These are the things that, if we focus on, help keep us in that middle way, and help keep us focused on the things that we're supposed to be looking for in our lives, and not being pulled into attachment and into these traps that the world around us has laid for us. questions on Buddhism? As much as I can answer, I'll try. Again, I'm not an expert on these religions. I don't know if anybody has any background in Buddhism. Sometimes sometimes there are people who are in class who actually come from a Buddhist background and stuff like that. So it's always good to hear from them. Vard, Cheyenne?
Oh, well, I still had a question from the Hinduism. So
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going back to that. I was thinking the other day about, the Sikhs and how they don't cut any of their hair. I don't know if you knew about that.
Yeah. So
And
Sikh is a different religion.
that's not part of Hinduism?
Sikh is its own religion. Yeah.
I just
Yeah.
found that really similar to the story of in Judaism of the group that doesn't cut their hair, and I was wondering if those were related at all.
So I don't think so. What we're talking about is a Nazir. We actually just read about it a couple weeks ago in the Haftarah. The Nazir Samson, right, not cutting his hair and stuff
Right.
like that. So I don't think there's a connection between Sikh religion and the Samson story per se. It just happens to be a way that that they observe spirituality, and a way that the Nazarites, the Nazarim, observe spirituality as well.
I see. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, of course. Ebony.
I don't have a background in Buddhism or Judaism or Hinduism, but I have studied them quite a bit.
Mhm.
And I do know that in Hinduism, there is a very strong belief that gods reincarnate constantly on Earth to like mitigate harm. Um, I'm not sure if you know, like, what do
Hold on, I think we lost you.
I'm not sure if you like know what Buddhists say about that aspect of
So
gods becoming
yeah,
reincarnated.
Hinduism definitely is more deistic than Buddhism is. There's no doubt about that, right? If you look at Shiva and all of those gods that you see in India, right, that comes out of Hinduism, much more so than Buddhism. Buddhism is less deistic, more, the world kind of power, the force sort of powers the world and powers everything, but it's not anthropomorphized, or it's not deified. That's at least as far as I understand, but I don't know much more than that.
I also wanted to say it's kind of interesting, the Eightfold Path and how similar it is to Nicomachean Ethics.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
it's very there's a lot of overlap there.
Look, I mean, and by the way, if we look at Jewish ethics, we're going to see a lot of this stuff in Jewish ethics as well, because these are smart, rational things to do if you want to live a good life, right? Spend time understanding the world around you. Think about your intent. Think about what you say. Think about what you do. Make sure that you have a livelihood that can support you and your family. Make sure that you put effort into the things around you, that you're mindful about what's going on, and you pay attention to the world, and these in and of themselves, these are not problematic for Judaism. The things that make Judaism and Buddhism incompatible on a philosophical fundamental level is the idea that life is illusory, that life is an illusion, and therefore our job is to detach and get away from it, whereas Judaism says, no, this is as real as it gets. Make it everything it can be. Awesome. All right. Let's continue with Islam. Islam means obedience or peace through submission to the will of Allah. It is actually the second largest religion after Christianity currently in the world. Historically, we're now talking about a time period that is much, much later than any of the religions that we talked about. So Buddhism, we said the Buddha lived around 563 BCE. Now we're basically talking about 1,000 years later. Muhammad was born in Mecca about 570 CE. He was orphaned and raised by an uncle. He was a camel driver, a trader, a husband, a father. He was well respected. He was known as the trusted one. And his passion, his sort of motivation for going out and trying to do things is he didn't like both the lawlessness that he saw around, and he was troubled by polytheism, by the idolatry, by worshiping all of these many gods. And while Abraham's belief in one God, i.e. Judaism, had spread to Arabia at one point in time, it had really been lost. But Muhammad was a believer in one God. He used to go out into the mountains and he used to pray. And when he was about 40 years old, he was in a cave near Mecca on Mount Hira. And it was then that, according to Muslim tradition, he received his first revelation from God. God spoke to him through the angel Gabriel, which is Gabriel, right? Same angel, same word, just Arabic versus Hebrew. And the tradition says that he continues to receive revelation all of his life. So after this, he went out and he began to teach and he began to preach and go out into Mecca and say that there is no God but Allah, but the one God. And people became interested in what it is that he had to say. And if anybody understands the way that the world works back then, when people become interested, the authorities become interested, right? Because it could potentially now be a threat. And the authorities then began a hostile campaign against Muhammad. And finally, in 622, he had to leave. Things got so hostile that he had to leave. He moved his entire community from Mecca to a city known as Medina, or the city of the Prophet. This journey was the first journey, or Hajj, or Hijra, migration. And it's fundamentally important because that is when the Muslim calendar actually begins, counting from that event. According to the Muslim calendar, we are now in the 15th century. His following grew as he continued to teach. And in 629, he was able to actually go back to Mecca. So he left in 622, 629, not that long, 7 years later, he was able to go back to Mecca and conquer. And he was known at that point in time then as a prophet of God. He did not live much longer than that. He died in 632. And his disciple, Abu Bakr, made the announcement to those who would believe. And he said, those of you who worship Muhammad must accept that Muhammad is dead. Those of you who worship Allah, Allah is living and will never die. So in the same way, by the way, that Judaism had a problem with the divinity of the messianic or Christ figure, Islam also said our main guy, Muhammad, is not divine. He was a prophet. He was a person. He's dead. We worship him. We don't worship him. We honor him, but we worship God. And ultimately, that became a really fundamental part of Islam. Muhammad is to be revered, but not worshipped. The sacred writings in Islam are called the Quran. It is believed to be the word of Allah that was revealed to Muhammad during his life, especially during the end of his life. And the belief, much like fundamentalist Judaism or fundamental Judaism, is that Allah is the author of the Quran, not Muhammad. So it's not Moses wrote the Torah, God wrote the Torah, Moses wrote it down. Same sort of idea. As you read through the Quran, it speaks of God's oneness, God's power, and ultimately about what Muslims should believe. And like the Torah, it gives guidance on how to live life as a Muslim. The Quran is something that Muslims study all of their life. Many of them learn surahs, chapters by heart. Some even try to memorize the whole thing. As we focus on sort of the basic Muslim beliefs, we see, number one, that there is a belief in Allah, right? Fundamental to Islam is belief in God. Also fundamental to Islam is belief in angels. Angels were very fundamental, much more so than in Judaism, in the conversations between Muhammad and Allah. And therefore, we see the angels take a much stronger role in Islam than they do in Judaism. There is a belief in the holy books, and that's all of the holy books, which include the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, and the Christian Bible. They are part of the biblical canon. The Quran is the New Testament, so to speak, so it comes to replace both the Tanakh and the Christian Bible. And in some ways, the Quran says, well, they got it wrong. They got the stories wrong. And they correct the stories the way that they believe, but they do respect both the Tanakh and the Christian Bible. And they believe in prophets. The prophets of the Bible, such as Abraham, right? Musa, Moses, Dawood, King David. Muslims respect Isa, which is how they refer to Jesus, as an important prophet, but not the Son of God. And they argue that Muhammad was and will be the last of the prophets. They believe in the day of judgment and life after death. On the day of judgment, everyone's deeds will be weighed, and those who are good will be able to pass through the hellfire and go on to paradise. And they also believe in predestination, which is that God controls everything that happens. And that's why you hear fundamentalist Jews sort of saying the same thing, Im Yirtzeh Hashem, if God wills it, but you hear that in Islam a lot more, if God wills it, right? As a response. Well, are you going to be joining me for dinner tomorrow night, if God wills it? Because everything is in the hands of God. When we talk about Islam, we talk about the 5 pillars of Islam. The first is the Shahada, which is the declaration of faith that is repeated several times a day. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. That is the Shahada. That is the sort of the phrase of faith. Kind of like our Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. This is their version of that, the Shahada. We talk about Salah, which is the 5 daily prayers that is said in Arabic. It's at dawn, just after noon, mid-afternoon, just after sunset, and at dark. The prayers are mainly verses from the Quran, praising Allah. Muslims wash, they take off their shoes for cleanliness before praying. If you've ever been in Israel or in any country around a mosque at these times, you'll know that the the time for prayer is broadcast by somebody who will cry out and say it is time for prayer, and then people know now it's one of these times for the 5 daily prayers. Zakah is the obligation to for those who can afford it, to give at least 2.5% of your savings and valuables to the poor. It is the pillar of that is ultimately charity. And while you're under no obligation to impoverish yourself, everyone is supposed to give, if you can. Saum means fasting. And this is during the month of Ramadan, which is the 9th month of the calendar. Muslims actually eat or drink nothing during the daylight hours. They are allowed to eat and drink once it is dark. And so what you will see during the month of Ramadan is there will be early morning before the sunrise. People will get up, they'll eat something, they will fast during the day. And then as soon as the sun goes down, they'll go and they'll have a feast. All the way during this month. And I've been invited, and I've been at the mosque over off of Community al-Sur a number of times during Ramadan, during these feasts. You know, it's a celebration. It's a time to get together and for them to celebrate, you know, what it means to be a Muslim. It reminds them that good things are to be enjoyed, but not overindulged in. And it's a time for study and self-discipline. During the month of Ramadan. It's time of reflection. And finally, the last pillar is the Hajj, which means pilgrimage. We mentioned that before. Hijrah, Hajj, it's the same word. Muslims hope to make a pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in their life to visit the Kaaba. The Kaaba is a place in Mecca that was believed to be built by Abraham and Ismail, which is Yishmael, in order to worship God at that place. The Hajj takes place during the 12th Muslim month. And what's interesting is that nobody is allowed to go on the Hajj without first making sure that their family is taken care of. So even though it's an obligation, you can't just get up and abandon your family. Now, in today's day and age, it's not such a big deal. You go, you get on a plane, you go, you can be back in a week, right? But think about it from the time when the Muslim empire was really spread throughout the world, into Spain, right? To go on the Hajj from Spain to Mecca in the Middle Ages, that's a long trip. And you may not survive it. And you want to make sure that you don't leave your family destitute. So those are the 5 pillars and the basic understandings of Islam. Now, the reality is that Judaism and Islam are actually more similar and have more in common than Judaism and Christianity do. We're actually really quite close on a lot of different things, including the problems that we have with the Trinity and the oneness of God and those sorts of things. Really, the difference is in some of these stories, right? We believe from the Torah that the story and the connection through God goes through Abraham to Isaac to Jacob. And Muslims believe that it goes from Abraham to Ishmael. And that is the story that they follow. Okay. Any questions? How are we doing on time? We're actually good. We have time for about 5 minutes of questions, 7 minutes of questions. Just before we get to more questions, just next week, we're going to start talking about Pirkei Avot. We're going to come back out of the comparative religions and now start talking about Judaism again, and starting to build up this idea of these fundamental concepts within Jewish philosophy and Jewish theology. All right. Question time. Marge.
So as you've presented it, we shouldn't have this major conflict with Muslims that we do. So but people will say there are things. I mean, I've gone to some other discussions where they say there are things in the Quran that are very problematic. And I'm wondering,
Agreed. But again, if we have a 70% or 80% connection with Christianity, we have like a 90% connection with Islam. The 10% is significantly different, right?
Is that 10% more problematic?
So look, what I would say is, through most of our history, we're going to see this in the history section. Through most of our history, we have had no problems with Muslims. On the contrary, right? When we look at the Middle Ages, the golden age of Spain was under the Muslim era, and that was the golden age of Jewish belief as well, right? It was the Christians that we really had problems with because of the persecution. The Muslims basically considered both Christians and Jews to be dhimmi, second-class status, but people of the book. And so long as you paid your dhimmi tax and you didn't do anything that was going to try and say that we were better than Islam, everything was fine. No problems. The issues we have with Islam today are not religious. They are geopolitical.
So they're not based in things in the Quran.
Everybody uses their religion to tell while they're right. But the reality of all of this is, and the same, by the way, the Muslims are saying the Quran says why they're right. The settlers are talking about why Hebron is ours, right? And we all use that. But the issue is geopolitical. The issue is about how the world unfolded after the Ottoman Empire, who has control of the land of Israel, and all of that. And that is a political question. It's not a religious question so much. People like to make it one, but I'm going to argue that it's actually a political question.
So I think what you're saying is you can have these religious differences, but it's the interpretation of them that creates the problem, not the actual written piece.
Well, look, there definitely are some issues. I'm not saying that they're not. I don't want to gloss over the issues, but the issues are not. The differences in the Quran are not what makes the problems. They add to the problems, right? They add to the problems, but they're not what's making the problems. Because we see for much of our history, it was not an issue. And we see there are places even in Israel nowadays. You go to Akko, there's no issues there between the Jewish and it's a very, very mixed city, right? It's really about the politics. It's really about the politics that has created the problem. Rona.
So Muslim extremists take a portion of the Quran to justify their attacks or why somebody else shouldn't live.
Yes.
Is that right?
Correct. As did the Jewish assassin of Yitzhak Rabin. Take something from Jewish tradition to explain why he did what he did. Right? Extremists are just that, extremists. And unfortunately, we have them on both sides. And unfortunately, for the most part, the extremists are in charge in the Palestinian areas. It's less so now in the Muslim world, which is frankly why you're starting to see Abraham Accords and those sorts of things, because the extremists aren't in charge in those places, right? And you're able to do that. So in the Muslim world, certainly in Gaza, the extremists are in charge. In the West Bank, the extremists in a lot of places are in charge. One could argue, which is a whole different political conversation, which we can have later on, that right now in Israel, there are some extremists that are in charge as well. And it doesn't bode well because of that. And extremists are dangerous. I would argue extremists are dangerous, no matter whose side they're on. The extremists on my side make me just as nervous as the extremists on the other side. So, any other questions? Ebony, is your hand still up, or is it different?
I was just going to say, it's interesting having grown up in the African American Episcopal and evangelical space. The Muslim friends that I have actually also feel like they have way more in common with Jews than Christians because of like kosher eating and halal eating, because like Jesus is not a deity within Islam and things like that. But the funny thing is Christians actually feel like they have way more in common with Jews than they do with Muslims. They actually think they're way more similar to Jewish people than they are with Muslims, which is kind of odd to me.
Right. Look, people ask all the time, people ask me why, why are Jews and Christians and Muslims always killing each other? You don't hear about Hindus and Jews killing each other, right? There's not that much to fight over between Judaism and Hinduism because we're so different, right? Siblings fight a lot more than strangers do for the most part, unless you're fighting over resources. Siblings fight for their parents' love and for attention and for all these other reasons. Judaism, Islam, and Christianity were siblings. And Judaism is sort of the oldest sibling. Islam is the youngest. Christianity is in the middle. Marge can give a master's class on, the psychology of the roles of all these different children, oldest, middle, youngest, and it'd be kind of interesting to see how that plays out with Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, right? Right? That's just part of it. That's part of our history and who we are.
Where do you feel that Mormons fall on the sibling situation? I mean, of course, I know that joke of like why the Mormons make Christians realize what Jewish people feel. But I know Christians don't feel any connection to Mormons at all.
Yeah.
But Mormons do feel a strong connection to Christians.
And Mormons actually feel a strong connection to Jews in the fact that Mormons feel that their history comes from ancient Jewish, tribalism as well. And so, look, it's difficult to make a comment about a secretive religion, right? Most of what we know about Mormonism now comes from the musical, The Book of Mormon, which certainly isn't showing them in the best of light. They're very insular. They're very secretive about what it is they do. There was an officer that I used to ride with all the time. He's since moved to actually Utah, who is Mormon. And I had great conversations with him, but never really understood what Mormonism was about because can't talk about it. So it's hard, I think, both for Jews and Christians to kind of relate to Mormonism because we just don't know. And it doesn't sound, it's new, none of us trust the new. They're the new kids on the block and it's difficult. All right. As I said, next week we're going to start talking about Pirkei Avot, ethics of the fathers. Those are going to be the morals and beliefs that sort of create our backbone of who we are as Jews. We'll then move into revelation and prayer as two parts of the conversation, right? We talk about a conversation with God. Revelation is the way that God speaks with us. Prayer is the way that we respond to God, at least in our classic sort of understanding of things. So we'll talk about those concepts as we wrap all of this up. All right. Have a great week, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye, all.
Thank you, Rabbi. Toda.
You're welcome.